Hello and welcome to another opening explorations video. And so this is a introduction to the Caro-Kann. It's pretty much for beginners or people that haven't played this opening and might want to try it out. So the Caro-Kann is E4 and then black responds with C6. So that C6 move in response to E4 is the Caro-Kann defense. So in this database, it shows by far the most common move is D4 here. So that's probably what you'll run into the most if you're playing this as black. And if you're playing it as white, this is usually a good option to take control of the center with both pawns. And then in the Caro-Kann, they'll most likely play D5 here. So that's the reason you play the pawn to C6 to be able to push to D5 and strike back in the center, attacking this E4 pawn. So now the main options appear to be E5, the advanced variation where you just push this pawn forward and gain space here for white. The other option is knight to C3, where you just develop the knight and you're protecting this pawn that's under attack. And then looks like the third option is to just capture in the center, the exchange variation. So first of all, I'll just look at the advanced variation, as it looks like that's being played the most. And it looks like white gets a higher win percentage with this move. So E5, and now the most common move by far, 26,000 versus 6,000 in the second most played move. The most common is bishop to F5. So we'll look at that first before I switch over to something else. So bishop to F5, and what this does is develop your bishop outside the pawn chain, because black will probably want to move this pawn up here to E6 to help fortify this D pawn, and then in the future maybe push this C pawn up to attack the D4 pawn. But first you'll want to get your bishop out and then push this pawn up to E6. And by putting the bishop here, the bishop is no longer going to be trapped behind its pawn here when it moves to E6. So now the most common move by white, it looks like, is knight to F3. And then we have this E6 move. And then by far, bishop to E2 is played most often. So this avoids the trade here, because if white plays bishop to D3, it does fight for this diagonal, but black could just trade off this bad bishop, get rid of it for white's good bishop. So here we have, let's see, knight to D7, and then castling by white, and then we'll play out the top played moves. Knight to E7, knight at B to D2, let's see, H6, so maybe giving an escape hatch for the bishop if the knight decides to attack it. And then this is interesting, knight to B3, which maybe discourages black from pushing this pawn forward. So in this position, we see that white's pawns, both sides' pawns are locked in the center, and usually you want to attack in the direction that your pawns are pointing. So these pawns are pointing up towards the king side, so white would like to just funnel his pieces over here and start an attack on the king side. And black, now he has his central pawns pointing down towards the queen side. So next, at some point, he's going to probably want to push this pawn forward and make more space and start attacking on the queen side possibly. So here, it looks like the most played move is, excuse me, it's black's turn, is g5 here. So starting a kingside attack, and then the recommendation or the most played move is retreating the knight, queen to c7, knight up to d3. So both knights are eyeing this c5 square, and now knight to g6. So here we just have a bunch of maneuvering. All right, well, I'm not going to go too much further. Let's see, we could play out maybe a couple more moves until the rest of the pieces are developed. So bishop to e3, castling on the queen side, bishop up to g4, and then, I don't know, you'd think that they would probably just capture here. And anyway, there you have it. Both sides are developed. Well, this bishop still has to develop, so black has options on what he might want to do with this bishop. And, maybe a kingside attack against white's king for black, and then white could start trying to, move up towards the queen side since they've castled on the opposite sides. All right, well, let's go back here. Back to the Caro-Kann. We looked at the advanced variation, which was this move right here. So this is the Caro-Kann advanced variation. And we took a look at the bishop to f5 move. Let's see here. Bishop to f5, knight developing, and so on. So if we go back and see what the other option is, instead of developing this bishop, the second most played move is c5. So this is the opening that I'm currently learning for black, is this advanced variation, but it looks like it's called the Botvinnik-Caro's defense, where black pushes forward here and attacks this valuable central pawn with the less valuable flank pawn. And it looks like the most often played move is just to capture. So now the number one recommendation is e6, something like this, and now you're attacking. And here, instead of protecting this pawn, it looks like a3 is played most often. So then the bishop can capture, and now b4 can be played, kicking that bishop. So then if the bishop retreats, it gives white time to develop the knight here, protecting this central pawn. Let's see, knight to e7, black would be ready to castle, and white does likewise, developing the bishop and getting ready to castle as well. And so now this move is played, putting some pressure on this knight. So white castles, black develops the knight, adding more pressure here, and it looks like, excuse me, the bishop is developed and helps protect the pawn. And so castling, rook moves to the center, helping reinforce this pawn even more. And now, interesting, the top move played is f6. But white doesn't win as much with that move. There's a 50% win ratio with bishop to d7. But we're getting down to a low number of games. So these accuracy ratings are not quite, maybe not quite as accurate when there are only a few games being played here. You don't have enough, a big enough grouping of games to accurately determine how often, or how well these moves, or basically how good the moves are, because they haven't been played in enough games. All right, so if we go back to e5, the advanced variation, and then this move, in the previous example, we looked at the capture here, and then this move. But that does block this bishop in. So, what if you maybe play the second best move? Just develop the knight. Now you're attacking this central pawn. But it could lead to this. The most common move is to pin that knight to the king. And now e6 is played. So the bishop ends up being trapped in here anyway. Let's see. Bishop to e3, protecting the pawn here. And then knight to e7. c3, maybe discouraging any future pawn pushes, or getting ready to move here with a pawn, and it'll be backed up by this c3 pawn. But bishop to d7 breaks the pin, so most often played is to capture. And then it's close. Looks like white wins more often, or excuse me, yeah, white wins more often if the knight captures. So the most common move is to capture with the bishop. And then, let's see, knight develops, knight to f5 attacking here, bishop up to d4. So now, if this bishop is captured, it gets rid of a bad bishop and helps repair these doubled pawns. So, white would not mind if that bishop is captured. And it looks like most often that's what happens. Capture, and instead of repairing the pawns, it looks like the number one move is to capture with the queen. So, that's an interesting choice there. Instead of repairing the pawns, you just capture with the queen, which does get the queen developed up to the center. And now queen to c7, maybe getting ready to pile up with the bishop on this pawn. So b4 protecting. And now looks like b6 is played most often. So then we just capture, and finally white castles. And then the game may continue with bishop to e7. And here, looks like there are multiple moves that can be played. I'd probably want to get this knight developed at some point and connect your rooks. All right. Well, that is another possibility of how this Caro-Kann advanced variation could be played. So if we go back to the beginning here. All right. So the advanced variation was that move. So let's take a look at some other possibilities. The second most played move, instead of the advanced variation, is the normal Caro-Kann defense, where they just bring this knight up to c3 to defend the e4 pawn. So now it looks like by far the best move, well, the most common move, is to just capture here. So then the knight recaptures, and now the bishop can attack, but then normally you don't want to move a piece twice in the opening, but here the knight can retreat and counterattack the bishop. So black has to move this bishop anyway. Well, I guess there is always, if the knight captures, you might have this possibility of a queen check and then picking the knight back up if it captures your bishop. But why give up your bishop pair if you don't have to? And if you're going to give up your bishop, it might be better to give it up for your opponent's bishop. That way they don't get to keep the bishop pair while you lose it. So the most common move is just to retreat back. But now we have this h4 move, threatening to trap the bishop. So h6 is usually played, and then develop the other knight, or you could push this pawn and attack the bishop immediately. So here we have knight developing, and then finally this h5 move is played. So the bishop retreats back, and then we have bishop to d3 here. So the bishops are lined up on each other, and of course black doesn't hesitate to get rid of this bishop here for white's good bishop, but it does allow the queen to develop. So white has 3 pieces developed to black's 1. So white is ahead in development and probably ready to castle queenside once this bishop is moved. All right, so the most common move is e6, then bishop up to d2, getting ready to castle queenside. Knight develops, castle, bishop develops, and now black is ready to castle. It looks like the most common move is this, maybe to prevent any future attacks on that unprotected A pawn, which is now protected by the king. Castle, so we have opposite side castling, and now it looks like knight to e4 is a common move. So capture, queen captures, knight attacks the queen, and now the queen usually moves to e2, maybe keeping an eye on this pawn along with the rook once this knight moves. So queen centralizing is a common move. Knight blocking the path and allowing the queen to help protect this pawn along with the rook. So if we go back, we see that the queen and knight were piling up on this pawn. So knight develops, but now this pawn could be captured here. But it looks like, black is not willing to do that because that would just open lines up straight to his king. So if the queen captured this pawn, this rook could move here, and actually this pawn is under attack as well. So there are a few tricks in this. If the queen captures this pawn, well, then the bishop could capture a pawn here and have a discovered attack on the queen. If this pawn is captured, the rook could move over, attacking the queen, and when the queen retreats, we could once again capture this pawn. So interesting possibilities and things to look at in this variation. So here it looks like, let's see if we go back. The knight moves up. Now it is time for black to move. It looks like queen to e4, attacking the queen is played most often. Then we have capture, capture. Then this is interesting. Bishop to e1 is played, which helps protect this bishop. Although, I don't know, I would have thought they maybe would have gone here, instead of interfering with the connected rooks. But anyway, it looks like that's played most often. Then rook to the center, f3, chase. Now we see why the bishop moved back, because now the knight has to retreat and cannot move here and attack the rook because the bishop is covering all these squares. So now it looks like after the retreat, you have bishop up to f2, and then another rook gets closer to the center, and these pawns start moving here. And as well these pawns. So we're going to have an opposite side castling game once again, where the pawns start storming on each side. Maybe something like this is played to help fortify this central pawn. Then knight to d5, knight to d3 to maybe keep an eye on the possibility of this pawn pushing forward. and to keep the knight out of this square here from being able to jump forward and cause problems. But then the game could continue like this. And anyway, you get the idea. So let's go back here a little bit and back to the beginning. We looked at e4 c6, the Caro-Kann, this common central move here. And then black responds by attacking. And we looked at the advanced variation, pushing this pawn forward. And then we looked at the common move is just knight to c3 to protect this. Let's see here. Most common is just to capture, and that's probably what you'll run into most of the time. I mean, other moves could be played, but the normal Caro-Kann moves were, as we just saw, capture, capture, and then bishop attacks. Although there are other possibilities. This could be played instead. Well, then here your best move is just to go capture here, and then what? We have either E takes f6 or G takes f6. So it looks like white has a slightly higher win ratio if the G pawn captures, because then that would break up these pawns here on the king side. Black would be left with an isolated H pawn. So it looks like most often this pawn captures away from the center. Usually you want to capture towards the center, but this keeps all the pawns together, and this F pawn can help guard the king side a little bit. So here c3 is mostly played, then bishop develops, black is ready to castle. Bishop to d3, aiming at the king side, but black's not worried about that and castles king side. Queen to c2, piling up on this pawn. So the most common move is rook to e8 first with check, knight up to e2, and then looks like h5. So that's interesting. h5, castle, h4. So there goes that h pawn in a hurry. And then h3 to kind of slow down the movement of that pawn, which is threatening to just keep pushing and trying to break open white's king side. So then we have knight to d7, bishop to d2. And this is an important move. Often this knight will move here. And a lot of times that knight will move there to protect this h pawn if it had remained on h7. But here this knight can reposition to the center or to g6. Let's see what is played most often here. So rook at a to e1, getting ready to fight for the open file. And now most often played is bishop to c7. Backing up here, maybe getting ready to reposition and aim down towards the king. So f4, g6, f5, g5, queen to d1. So maybe getting ready to jump into this position here. Queen to d6. Knight. Oh, that's interesting. Knight to f4. Huh. Knight to f4. Okay, now why wouldn't you just capture that? Well, the queen could jump up here and check. We'll have to take a look at that. Most often played is just bishop to d7. So bishop to d7, and then what? Queen up to h5 here. All right, well, we'll take a quick look at what would have happened if we have this. So if they capture, then the queen could just move here. Maybe start harassing the king. Oh, and then you have this bishop here. Yeah, so that looks pretty dangerous. All right, well, let's go back here. Take a look at a few more variations. This video could go on forever, and we don't want that. So let's just take a look at a few more things. So, from the beginning, the Caro-Kann, e4, c6, d4, d5. And now the knight protects, capture, knight captures. And we looked at the most common move, bishop to f5. The second most common was knight to f6. And then, almost as common is this knight to d7 move. So we might as well look at that. Then we usually have knight to f3, knight at g to f6. And most often we have capture, capture, bishop to c4, white is ready to castle, bishop to f5, castle, e6 to be able to bring this other bishop out, c3, fortifying the central pawn, bishop to e7, ready to castle kingside, rook grabs the half open file, castling, and then here with a 100% win rating by black is this bishop to, oh, excuse me, it's white's turn. Bishop to g5, but it looks like that's 100%. Oh no, 100% draw rating, my mistake. And that's something with the Caro-Kann. It's more of a drawish opening. If you have to win with black, you might want to go for maybe a Sicilian defense. But if you need a draw and you want to play a more solid game, or if you're playing against maybe a higher rated opponent, you might want to choose the Caro-Kann for black. All right, so h6, then bishop to h4. Anyway, you get the idea. We could play this out a little bit further. So knight e4 attacking, capture, queen captures, bishop to d3 attacking the knight. After the knight retreats, capture, capture. So a lot of material just traded off here into a kind of a drawish position. So that is another way that the game could have gone. So let's take a look at a few other options here. After e4, c6, the most common move is d4, but you could run into the second or third most common moves, which may transpose into each other. So knight to c3, d5, so black just plays the same way he would if they had moved the pawn to d4, and then knight to f3. So this is the two knights attack by white, which develops pieces instead of pawns. So this might be a good option to play for white. Most commonly played is this pin on the knight. Then you force the bishop to make a decision here. Capture or retreat. So it looks like most often played is capture, capture, e6 fortifying the central pawn, d3 fortifying as well, knight develops, bishop to d2, white is ready to castle queenside and maybe start a kingside attack. Knight develops, and here comes the kingside attack. h6 to slow it down, and we have a castling to the queen side. Queen lines up here on this b pawn. queen to g3 to allow this pawn to push forward perhaps. And then d4, attacking the knight. So knight retreats, counterattacking the pawn. And then we have, most often played is bishop to b4. Or black could just castle. Or e5, protecting the pawn here. So we'll look at the most common move, although, excuse me, we're down to only 3 games. So here, capture, queen captures, and then f4. So castle to the same side. Usually same side castling is, it leads more to calm games, not as crazy. When you have opposite side castling, the games can get more wild and crazy because each side can just start launching a pawn storm, throwing pawns forward at their king. But if both sides are castled if on the same side, it's less likely that the pawns will be launched forward because that'll create weaknesses around their own king. All right, so we have bishop to g2, knight to c5, and that's about as far as we're going to go here. So that gives you another idea of how the game could go, and that was the 2 knights attack, I believe. So here white brings their knights out early, and the game plays out a little differently than the normal Caro-Kann. All right, so what are the other options here? So after this move, c4 looks like that's another possibility. But if we play normal like this, and then d5, what else could we play here? We looked at e5, the advanced variation. Oh, the exchange variation. So we definitely should take a look at that as well. So the exchange variation, we have a capture and a recapture. So here, when you have exchange in the center, the game is going to come down to who can develop more quickly. They'll have an advantage here. So it looks like the most commonly played move is c4 here. So now we have almost like a Queen's Gambit type setup. But in the Caro-Kann, this is called the Panov attack. Because we've already exchanged off the c pawn for white's e pawn. So here there are different options. The pawn could be captured, leaving white with an isolated queen pawn, which is a whole other situation. If you're going to play an isolated queen pawn game, then you have to know how to play that, which I won't get into here. So looks like knight to f6 is played most often. Knight to c3, e6. So it's almost like a Queen's Gambit with pawns already exchanged off though. Knight to f3, bishop to b4 or e7. So if we play the most common move, now we have capture, knight captures, piling up here, threatening to capture with the knight. If the pawn captures and the bishop captures, we'll have a fork of king and bishop. So bishop to d2 takes care of that. Knight develops. Bishop to d3. Castle. Castle. And then the bishop retreat, keeping the bishop pair. And now a3 is the most common, keeping these knights out of the b4 square where they can attack the light squared bishop here. So we do have this queen, isolated queen pawn game. And in that, I guess I will talk about it. When somebody has an isolated queen pawn, they can place the rooks or queen on these open or half open files on either side of the isolated pawn. And then the side attacking with the isolated pawn, white, they want to avoid trading pieces, because the more pieces that are traded off, the harder it'll be to defend this pawn as the game progresses. So white wants to avoid piece changes and kind of use this pawn as an attacking point to go after black, and black wants to try to exchange pieces off. So black will try and blockade the isolated pawn, which he's done here with the knight, and then add pressure. So now we have another piece piling up on this. So here, instead of protecting the pawn, the most common move is to counterattack this pawn. So g6 prevents any attacks here. Now bishop to h6, attacking the rook. Rook moves. And then rook at a to d1. So now if the pieces start capturing, so if we have a capture, knight captures, bishop captures, we'll have a discovered attack possibly over here once that bishop moves and captures a pawn. So most often played is capture. So trading off a pair of pieces, which is usually to the side's or to the advantage with the side that does not have the isolated pawn. So now most often played is this move, fortifying the isolated pawn, and now there's the isolated pawn over here. So this gets rid of the isolated pawn in the center, but now there's the isolated pawn on a3, but it's not currently under attack. So bishop to d7, queen to d2, and bishop here guarding. Most often played is instead of immediately trading off, h4, which is a common theme when there's a fianchettoed position and you can march this h pawn up and try and attack the fianchettoed pawn's position here. Let's see. Knight to e7, bringing some defense to the king side. Rook at f to e1. Rook takes the half open file. And then h5, attacking here. And most commonly played, it looks like, is, well, the only move that they're showing here is f6. Then we have capture, knight captures, and c4. Then, I don't know, I'll play this out a little bit further, see how far it goes. Bishop to e3 to help protect and keep the bishop pair. Queen to f7. Rook to c1, helping fortify this pawn. Bishop to c6. Bishop to e2. Rook at c to d8, lining up on the queen. So the queen moves, lining up on king and queen, and helping protect this pawn, perhaps. King gets out of the line of fire. Rook at e to d1. Knight to e7. Anyway, you get the idea here. So that's another possible way the game could have gone after e4, c6, d4, d5, capture, and this, the Panov attack. So if they don't use the Panov attack, what is the second most common move? Bishop to d3, and then knight to c6, maybe threatening to come down and chase the bishop. So c3 is played, and the knight, was putting pressure on this pawn. So now c3 takes care of two problems. helps fortify the central pawn and keep the knight out of b4. So knight develops, bishop develops, and likewise we have bishop developing with an attack on the queen. Queen moves and attacks this pawn. So here, queen to d7, knight to d2, e6, knight to f3, capture, capture, bishop develops, capture, capture, castling by white, black also castles, and then the rooks are developed towards the center. Anyway, this is how the game could play out. I'll go a few more moves here. Queen to d2, maybe trying to take advantage of the weak and dark squares. King moves up. Knight tries to grab an outpost, but is captured. Pawn captures, chasing the knight, which retreats, counterattacking the pawn along with the queen. So we have either queen to f4, or f4 here. I don't know about queen to f4 because they could just put more pressure on that pawn. f4 would help fortify the pawn and give you more space, whereas queen to f4, I don't know, that looks like, would they just try that maybe? Although then this pawn would be weakened. And no, you can't do that because you could capture the pawn with check and then pick off the queen. So then we would have what? Hikaru Nakamura with white. His opponent played king to g8, and then Nakamura plays queen up to g5, queen to d8, up to h6, and then that looks like that's about all we have. All right, well, let's go back and see if there's anything else to check out before I wrap this video up. So e4, c6, the Caro-Kann defense. Normally you'll see d4, and then d5. So we looked at e5, the advanced variation, knight to c3, which is the more common, the regular Caro-Kann opening, the exchange variation where we captured here. The other option is knight to d2, so protecting the pawn. Then after capture, knight captures. It can transpose back into the regular opening, where we just attack, or we attack with the knight developing, just play knight to d7. So that kind of just transposes back into the same moves as if we would have played, instead of that, if we just played this and then they captured. All right. What else do we need to look at here? Anything off the wall, like a little bit, some of the strange possibilities. So if it starts out normal and they don't play the advance or the regular knight to c3 variation or the exchange, another option is this, the fantasy variation. So what here is normally played? Well, it looks like e6 is played most often, then knight to c3, bishop pinning the knight, that's ignored, and bishop to f4 is played, knight to e7, queen to d3, b6, knight develops, bishop attacks the queen. After the queen moves, we have castling, opposite side castling, c5, a3, putting the question to the bishop, and capture, queen captures, capture, capture. Now what? c4 is played most often. So with that move, space is gained on the queen side, and the pawns are aiming down towards white's king here on the queen side. So opposite side castling, white launches his pawns forward on the king side. Knight develops, h5, b5, queen back to e1, where it can reposition maybe over here and help in the attack on the king side. Queen develops, connecting the rooks, and then we have g4 here. The pawn storm is underway. So f6 to try and slow things down a little bit. Bishop retreats. Rook at a to d8. And bishop to h3. All right, so capture, capture. Knight takes. g5. f5. King over to b1, and queen lines up on this pawn. h6 is played. Capture. I don't know. At this game, it looks like black is taking over here, although white won this game apparently. So after e3, rook captures. Queen captures with check. Man, this turned out to be a crazy game. Then black picks this off. Capture. Man. Yeah, this is pretty wild. Queen to g4. Attacking the bishop. All right. Queen to h8. Oh, queen to h8 check. Look at that move. So, you don't want to capture this queen, or else, well, then you capture this. Well, I'm not sure what happened in this game, if they ran out of time or what was going on, but anyway, that gives you an idea of how some of the more quiet Caro-Kann games can go the other way and get a little crazy. All right, back to the beginning, see if there's anything else we needed to cover. So we just looked at this move, the fantasy variation. What else do we have besides that? Not much else. Bishop to d3, but now we're getting down to moves that are not played very often. So I guess I'll wrap this up. Here's what we looked at. e4 and c6 by black is the Caro-Kann. And there's different options on how white can play, but usually, and by far, the most often played move is d4, because the Caro-Kann allows white to grab a nice pawn center with both pawns, and then black fights that with d5, the most common move. And then here you have different options. The advanced variation by pushing this pawn to e5, or knight up here to c3. The exchange variation, just capturing in the center. Or you could even play knight to d2, but that's about the same as knight to c3. the fantasy variation. And then the other variation was this bishop to d3 move. All right, so what else could be played here? The second most common move is knight to c3, third is knight to f3, and they can lead to the two knights attack. So black is usually just going to play like a normal Caro-Kann style, and then both knights are developed. So this is the two knights attack. And then you could have an attack here on the, you pin this knight with bishop to g4. But one move we didn't look at was an immediate capture, knight to f6, attacking. It looks like queen to e2 is played most often. Second is just capturing and doubling up the pawns here. But you could play this, capture, queen captures, knight develops, getting ready to jump over here and chase the queen away. But in the meantime, white develops, knight attacks the queen, and then here, pretty tricky, is this. So if the queen is captured, there's a checkmate with bishop takes on f7. And looks like either blocking or apparently people have lost by overlooking this checkmate threat and attack the bishop, and then the bishop can just capture and deliver a mate here. But most often played is this, blocking the path of the bishop. Now the queen has to move, so queen to e2, protecting the knight and the bishop. b5, bishop retreats. Queen to c7, putting a little pressure on the knight. d4, bishop adds the pressure to the knight. Castle, bishop develops. a5, threatening to trap the bishop here. So c3, fortifying the central pawn, making an escape hatch for the bishop. And now c5, capture, queen captures, and rook at a to d1, trying to grab the open file. So bishop retreats, and rook up to d4 here, getting ready to double the rooks. Bishop aims at the king side, and now we have rook at f to d1. The rooks are doubled. a4 attacking the bishop. Bishop lines up on the king side here. Now a3. Capture. Rook captures, attacking this pawn. The bishop protects and aims back up through the middle. Bishop to d5. Knight to d3, attacking the queen. What is this? Oh, okay, this is an okay move. Capture. Bishop to e3, protecting the rook. Capture, and it's not looking good for white now. Attack the rook. Rook over to h4. Rook to d8. g4. Queen captures. g5. Oh man, yeah, it's looking horrible for white now. White tries to avoid more trades, but they're pretty much losing. So queen to h5, threatening a mate. Well, not a mate, because they can escape. So capture. Queen captures. King escapes. Rook to b1, attacking the queen. Queen centralizes. And it looks like we just have a win there for black. I mean, what can they do next? The queen could go up here. The king will escape. I don't know, not much else happening. And material-wise, black is just ahead with this extra knight and bishop. All right, well, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Feel free to leave comments or anything you would like to say. Let me know if you play this Caro-Kann opening, if you tried it, what you think. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.